Hello, my dear Hellspawn on the other side of the screen.
Welcome to the next part of our top 10 people whom I respect the most and who have shaped me decisively. The person who occupies the second place has devoted himself even more than Dawkins to fighting the disease religion. His whole life work was a single argument against religion and especially against Christianity.
Number 2. Karlheinz Deschner.
Luckily, Germany too has its critics of church and religion. Unfortunately, one of the most famous of them died in 2014 at the age of 89 years. However, he still managed to complete his life work, the 10-volume Criminal History of Christianity. Each volume deals with the atrocities, wars, injustices that have been committed in the name of Christianity over the course of the last 2000 years, from ancient times to the 20th century. He also deliberately dissected the entanglement of the church in the two world wars and always provided evidence and sources for all of his statements and claims. Even though he was always hated by church apologists.
Und wenn man da zu den Ursprüngen hingeht, dann sieht man, nicht wahr, dass alles schon von den Anfängen an nicht stimmt. Theologiegeschichtlich nicht stimmt und kirchenhistorisch nicht stimmt.
Sie meinen das alles ernst, was Sie schreiben und sagen. Und Sie genieren sich nicht für dieses Cocktail aus Lüge, aus Fälschung, aus Genialität, aus Begabung und aus Halbwahrheiten und Viertelwahrheiten. Sie genieren sich dafür nicht.
Also wenn ich
2000 Jahre die Kirche der Liebe, denn wir sind nämlich Brüder und Schwestern alle hier und wir sprechen dialoghaft. Wir gehören zusammen,
ich würde Ihnen das ja gerne glauben, wenn Sie immer, aber Ihre Kirche hat doch durch 2 Jahrtausende Menschen verfolgt. Sie haben doch Millionen...
2000 Jahre Liebe.
So,
2000 Jahre Blutzeit.
2000 Jahre Judenverfolgung, 2000 Jahre Ketzerverfolgung.
Reden Sie doch nicht so historischen Blödsinn zusammen.
Historischen
Aber diese Pauschalierung, diese Generalisierung, dieser Mangel an Unterschied, genieren Sie sich, Herr Deschner.
Also historisch ist es doch eine Tatsache, wenn ich das mal sagen darf, dass die Frau im Christentum seit fast 2000 Jahren hanebüchen unterdrückt wird. Das ist umso perfider, als Jesus selbst, wie man weiß, im Unterschied zu Paulus, eine sehr positive, jedenfalls der biblische, der synoptische Jesus, eine sehr positive Haltung gegenüber den Frauen hat. Nein, ich möchte jetzt auch mal ein bisschen sprechen. Nein, Sie wollen mich hier nicht zu Wort kommen lassen.
Dann liegt, dass Sie Unsinn reden und hier verbreiten.
No one could accuse him of sloppy work or a falsification of the facts. On the contrary, it was often confirmed by his opponents that he had done his homework and they had nothing to counter his statements. Only the accusation that he was one-sided and only represented the negative had a certain justification if one wanted to be malicious. But this, too, is quickly put into perspective since he himself already pointed out his one-sidedness in the introduction to the first volume of his Criminal History of Christianity, pointing out that there is literature on the positive aspects of Christianity in abundance, and that his criminal history had precisely the intention to gather and bundle together the negative aspects, often concealed or glossed over by the church side over the centuries. He achieved this goal successfully. The abundance of facts he presents is impressive, and everyone with an interest in history should be glad that he has managed to finish his life work, with which he had begun in 1970. His writing style was anything but dry. There was a lot of cynicism and black humor in his works. As with Elias Canetti, I have already encountered Deschner's work during my studies. After being introduced to his writing, I researched his other books and found some jewels that I would not have expected. Deschner began his career as an author with a novel that was unrivaled and had attracted a lot of attention in the literature scene in that year. The Night Stands Around My House is a novel from 1956, written entirely as a stream of thought, with autobiographical features which broke some of the taboos at the time concerning sex, morals and religion. The book is now more current than ever before and does not have to hide from the best passages of James Joyce's Ulysses. I read some excerpts from it to you soon. His second work, Kitsch, Conventions and Art, was a literary critique in which he criticized the works of authors who were valued and renowned at the time, such as Heinrich Böll or Günter Grass. Deschner compared them with artistically more sophisticated but also more unknown authors such as Hans-Henny Jahn. This too triggered a storm of indignation. Afterwards, his great reckoning with the Catholic Church followed with The Cock Crowed Once Again. Following this, the releases alternated between critical works of literature and church, in which he also examined sexual morality of Christianity and the war crimes of the church. He began his research for the criminal history of Christianity in 1970, the first volume of which, The Ancient Christianity, was released in 1986. The 10th and final volume was released in 2013. In 1971, he was accused of insulting the Christian churches in public in accordance with the unspeakable anti-blasphemy article 166. In the 70s and 80s, he traveled a lot and gave speeches and lectures and was also occasionally seen on television. However, since he always destroyed his church opponents with facts and arguments, soon there was no one on the side of the church who wanted to face him in a discussion. Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris are also always the victors of their debates because they simply have the better arguments. People like Deschner, who so consistently swim against the current, are rarely becoming rich. And so Deschner was glad that he had benefactors and patrons like the entrepreneur Herbert Steffen, who also founded the Giordano Bruno Foundation. Deschner was able to work and research in peace without worrying about basic things such as rent and getting food on the table. In addition to his church critical works, he also took the time for a few aphorism books in which many ingenious sayings on politics, religion, humanity, animals, and society can be found. And of course, the energy with which he opposed the churches in a country in which the public broadcasting stations, the press, media, and political parties are filled with church representatives, people and organizations close to or financed by the church, has also made him many enemies, and thus a persona non grata. Incidentally, just as a side note regarding separation of state and church, it is preposterous that one of the largest parties in Germany bears a religion in the name. Apart from the party programs, CDU and CSU are completely unelectable to me just because of this, and should be unelectable to anyone else who advocates for separation of church and state. Just think about the fact that you have a pastor's daughter as a chancellor for over a decade now, and with Gauck we had a pastor and church functionary as a federal president. If non-Western countries have such constellations, people call them theocracies, right? But back to Deschner. Of course he was met with hostility, like anyone who shines light into areas that the criticized people and organizations would rather leave in the dark. Like anyone who wants to change the status quo and who is also able to show the errors and interrelations of the powers that be. But the multitude of letters he has received from his readers, and which of course included the usual insults, also shows that he has opened the eyes of many people and given them the courage to quit the church, which in the second half of the last century still was a difficult decision for many people. Just regarding this, his merits can't be appreciated highly enough. Every human being, every fate escaping from the clutches of the churches and religions is a gain for civilization and the future, and development of humanity as such. I can only recommend reading Deschner's works to anyone. If the 10 volumes of his criminal history are too much for you, you can start with The Cock Crows Once Again, or With God and the Fascists. If this is still too extensive, I recommend 2 volumes with short essays and excerpts from his bigger works, Oben ohne or Memento. And the aphorisms offer something for everyone. Many people nowadays think that Christianity and the Christian churches are no longer a serious problem in the West today. This assessment is catastrophically wrong. Among other things, for reasons already mentioned above. Christianity is just as shrewd as Islam, in the writings of which it is well documented that Muslims are instructed to at least publicly submit to the rules and laws of the country they live in, as long as they are in the minority. But as soon as they are in the majority, they are instructed to even act with violence against unbelievers. In the case of the Christian churches, it is deceptive, in that they have largely adapted to modern circumstances in order not to lose the power which they still have. As always, follow the money. The churches still have land, riches and influence in all areas. And no one should believe that the Christian churches would not begin to silence, censor and defame non-believers as heretics if the right circumstances arise. Would the church be able to get through with this? This is another big issue for another time. But back to Deschner. Christianity, or rather criticizing it, was his life's work. He often regretted in interviews that he has spent so much time of his life on this, that he would rather have spent on the beautiful things of life. But someone had to do this ungrateful work, to create at least a comparatively small, compact counterweight to the church propaganda. I would have liked to see him also tackling Islam more, but he is right to dismantle Christianity. First, we have to clean up our own house and free ourselves from self-imposed constraints. Islam is nothing else but Lenny, Michael Keaton's mentally retarded clone from Multiplicity. Do you know Multiplicity? It is a comedy from 1996 in which Keaton's character clones himself and the clones get dumber from copy to copy. The analogy fits very well, since the three great monotheistic religions are also only unoriginal rip-offs, copies of each other. Christianity is a clone of Judaism and Islam is a clone of Christianity. And as if this wasn't bad enough already, Judaism itself contains nothing original and just has adapted most of the heathen and pagan customs and myths. No wonder that Islam is called the final religion. The monotheistic religions already are a copy of the copy of the copy. And Islam is the mentally retarded clone which wouldn't be able to survive in a free world. And it proves this almost every day when Sunnis, Shiites, Salafists, Wahhabists, and however else these morons call themselves, kill each other and innocent people because of different interpretations of their fairy tales. I do not even want to imagine what would happen if someone were to make another clone of these religions. But I digress again. Here in Germany, Karlheinz Deschner, who always referred to himself as an agnostic, was something like the spearhead of the unbelievers, non-believers and religious critics. With the free philosopher Michael Schmidt-Salomon, we have somebody who, in connection with the Giordano Bruno Foundation, also deals with the promotion of a humanistic, naturalistic society, but somehow the German-speaking scene of religious criticism is quite small, or gets little media attention. I have the impression that still a lot must happen on this front. Either the individual organizations, which indeed do exist, must better network with each other, or start joint actions in order to reach ordinary citizens and to ensure that Deschner's preliminary work was not in vain and disappears in the meaningless void. Karlheinz Deschner deserves this, not only as a fighter against Christianity, but as a fighter for free thinking, humanistic ethics and morality, as well as for a secular society which not only has freedom of religion, but, in the ideal case, freedom from religion. I don't agree with all views of everyone on this list by 100%. That would be nonsense too. But I don't mention these differences here because this is about why I respect these people. But I would love to discuss the various differences I have with these people. Since some of them have already passed away, sadly, this is no longer possible. Unfortunately, this also applies to my undisputed number one. I think most of those who have followed this top 10 from the start already know, or at least can guess, who is sitting on this throne. Guess away in the comments and stay tuned for the final entry in this series. If you don't want to miss it, subscribe.
To be continued. Count on it.